Hey, welcome to Overtime, where we take Sunday's message further. My name is Jeremy, and I'm your host. And this is a podcast where we just want to ask the questions that we think that you would ask as it relates to Sunday's message. And as we do so, we hope that it helps you grow in your life and your faith. With that being said, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on all of the podcasts that are coming out. Not only that, hit the like button, because when you do so, it helps us help other people. And if you ever have a question about Sunday's content or about Overtime, you can submit those to overtime@npaustin.com, and we will be sure to get to those in future podcasts. So with that being said, here's a quick recap of Sunday, and then we're going to jump into our conversation today. Is that when we begin to take steps in the direction of growing our character, we all bump into something. The vice I am talking of is pride. Pride paralyzes your character. See, Jesus, I think, was brilliant in the way that he saw people. And so he says these two powerful words to his disciples: follow me. An invitation to follow Jesus is an invitation to unfollow pride. Here's what Solomon writes: better to live humbly with the poor than to share plunder with the proud. It's those two words right there in that sentence that give us the key of what it means to unfollow pride. Humility is viewing ourselves and our achievements through the lens of who God is. We have to have a moment where we realize that humility is the invitation to unfollow pride and follow character.
I just feel like I need like 5, 4, 3.
Yeah.
Did you see Wayne's World?
Yeah, I've seen Wayne's World.
So you know how they like, anyway, okay, sorry. That's impressive you've seen Wayne's World.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Well, I mean, was it like, because it's not really like a movie from your era.
Right.
It's definitely my
I
era.
probably saw it when I was like 12 or 13.
Okay, but then it was like, came out before you were born, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
We'll have to
No,
look that
my extended family like watched or was into all those movies, or like
Okay.
Wayne's World, Breakfast Club, like, you know, a lot of these kind of
Totally
like
not the same. Okay, cool.
No, not the same thing, but what Austin Powers, like
Okay,
a
yeah.
lot of these kind of like
that
movies.
Okay.
And so my biggest growing up, I would say, like, Josh hears me say this all the time, but the movies I watched the most were Ace Ventura and Will Ferrell movies.
Okay.
So, like, you know, if we're moving stuff into the storage units in the back of Northpoint, every time, like, we put it, and I'm like a glove is what I say, and
yeah.
nobody else around me gets it, and I've had to explain to him.
Well, but do you say it like he says it?
Like a glove, right?
Can we please put that in this podcast?
This is all.
Oh, is this all going in? We're already rolling?
We're already going. Your 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 was what
Oh.
kicked it off. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, then welcome. That's good. Okay, let's actually jump into the actual conversation. But hopefully
Well, I will say too, and then when I'm on a plane ride, I don't think I did this with you last time, but there's someone on the wing, something. Do you know what I'm talking about?
No, I don't know that one.
Have you Ace Ventura when they're in the plane and?
I don't remember that scene.
Oh, and then recently, our friend Barry gave us. He killed a yak, and he was sharing the yak meat with us.
He killed a yak.
Yeah, he got so he got the yak meat. So we're cooking yak in the kitchen, and so I get the magazine, and I'm like, yak, because it's from Ace Ventura, and Ashley's just like, she gets so frustrated because she doesn't know the reference, and then every single time she's like, please don't pull up the YouTube video to show me what it is. And so of course I pull it up on the TV and just blast it in the house to show her the reference, so she understands and she laughs with me.
I love hearing about that side of you.
This has Ace Ventura, Will Ferrell.
This has been my working relationship with Jeremy for years now.
But I love it.
Listening to him make these obscure references to old movies.
Yeah,
I've never seen.
I can quote some of these movies all the way through.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I feel like we could unpack that a little bit.
That would be interesting. Like,
especially that choice.
Oh my gosh, that's an interesting icebreaker question. Like, what movie could you quote all the way through? For me, it's Nacho Libre.
I don't know that there's any.
Yeah.
I don't know that I have one.
But that's unfortunately
probably a
not
Disney.
a good movie. It's not really above reproach. But
The Step Brothers
movie. It was
movie?
pre-Jesus in my life, was Step Brothers, and I just thought it
people
was the
who
funniest movie.
are post-Jesus can't watch Step Brothers? Is that what you're saying?
No, it's just, there's a lot in there. There's a lot in there that's Jesus wouldn't say it. Let's just say that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
But it's hysterical. So
Okay.
Nacho Libre is about a Catholic.
I've seen that one. I don't think I could quote it.
Oh man!
I mean, I love Jack Black. He's probably one of my favorite actors.
That has got to be the greatest movie of all time.
Oh.
In my humble opinion.
Yeah.
Maybe we should. Yeah.
And School of Rock. I don't know. Maybe I'm just a big Jack Black fan. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, let's
Anyways,
jump into
impossible transition.
You did an awesome job Sunday. I love that you called yourself a hobbit. I love the picture of you with your gigantic backpack. Actually had a conversation with Shane Norcross about your overpacking and the discussion about just the differences in personalities and packing and experiences.
Yeah. Well,
right?
you know, Kyle was with us
Yep.
on that, which Kyle, and he was the other big backpacker, the big backpack, big backpacker.
Yeah.
And but the joke throughout the, him and I are just struggling, like we're in the back of the pack. They're waiting on us the whole time. And then we finally get out there, and Kyle's like, who up on the top of the mountain where we're camping, who wants a snack? And then he pulls out this bag of snacks, and he's got like so many Pop-Tarts and all sorts of stuff, which we were all thankful for. But we were like, why in the world did you bring
carry
that
all
snacks? Yeah. So he's
well,
like the snack guy.
I loved it. And you made my my Inside Out small group girls want to go to Big Bend.
Oh,
so now they're like,
funny.
you're going to take us backpacking to Big Bend, right?
Oh,
I'm like, nope,
my gosh.
Jeremy will. Someone else will. Not me, not 10 high school girls.
Yeah. they will change their mind very fast.
Yeah. I was like, well, we may go and rent someplace or something. So
Yeah,
anyway, I thought it was really good. I loved it. I think that the conversation is one of those that we probably have to at least have annually, right? Like a hey, do you really know what it looks like on the other side of you? Which is such a great question. I love that you kind of was like a practical thing you can do at work or in your marriage or even with your kids, right? Like you can take a step and say like, what is it actually like in front of me? But one of the things I wanted to start with today and kind of grabbing this time, and I'm sure you had more that you couldn't share on Sunday, but other thoughts on how to get an adequate picture of that, because I do think, like, I can't ask you after every meeting, what was it like on the other side of me? So, and not every situation is that going to be really viable. And even that, honestly, so that's a part of our pride or a part of our perception. But there's other aspects of us that people can't reflect on that way. So what other ways, how can we get clarity? Like, how can we actually see what we're actually like?
Yeah, I mean, this is like a huge topic of like, how do you become more self-aware?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
In a lot of ways. And I think, we just mention it on the podcast all the time because so much in life comes down to it, even to this conversation right here. But if there's nobody that knows you 100%, it's going to be really hard to ever see what you're doing that's potentially doing damage to yourself and those around you, because there's nobody else there to reflect something to that, or to catch you in your tracks when you're trying to justify something. Kyle's a good friend of mine, and we were talking about our goals for 2023. And I was telling him like, oh, there's some things, it's one of the areas I feel really confident in right now. Like Ashley and I's marriage, like we feel good, and we've been through a lot of hard seasons, but we're just in a good one right now. And then I caught myself going like, but we haven't been on a date night in like 2.5 months, but it's fine because we're, and then I went, I'm justifying right now like the complacency of not dating my wife. Yeah. And I was only able to realize that in that moment and go, no, I need to go on dates with my wife. I need to be intentional about this. Like we're about to have another kid, and it's going to be even more difficult to, with 2 under 2 to prioritize that time. And so it was me being caught in the act of justifying behavior that I wasn't currently doing as I'm trying to tell him why it's not important for me to do that, going like, okay, clearly there's. And so having those conversations, those people in our life reveals so much to ourselves and what we're trying to justify to other people. Or what we are like not seeing at all, and being able to ask the question, if you don't have anybody to ask that question to, and that's a big red flag. Yeah. And there are people I know who have been a part of communities before, and then they just disengage completely, and they're just isolated, and that is major red flag for character, is because you don't have any mirror for anybody to reflect something back to you. Yeah. So I think that's one of the biggest ones, and then also just like introspection. And I quote this one all the time, but one of my favorite proverbs is, a man's heart are like deep waters, one with insight draws them out. And it's that idea of deep water, like when you're on a boat in the ocean and you look down, like it's kind of scary, like what is in there, what kind of monsters are down in those deep waters. And that's like our heart in a lot of ways. And if we don't take time and intentionality and energy to discover the skills necessary to develop what it means to see what's going on inside of us, then we're going to miss a lot. And so for me, I've talked about it a bunch, but journaling is one of those things for me. And one of the skills I had to develop was, or I've had to develop and am continuing to develop, is understanding the kind of emotions I'm experiencing, which is not like a manly thing to talk about. And so I think it's in our culture is really pushed down. But one of the things one of my mentors gave me is pull open your phone, go to the emojis, and then pick an emoji that you most resonate with in that moment, and then see what the label for that emoji is, and maybe that's going to be what your emotion is. And so I've done that for a while to where now it's easier for me to go, I'm frustrated because of this.
Yeah,
and
that's
therefore
what I'm actually feeling.
Yeah, and so okay, and then just putting that through the grid of filters around like, well, what does God say about that? You know, well, what kind of outcome is this going to create in my life? And being able to take, it's a very practical way of taking thoughts captive and making them obedient to Christ. Yeah. And so I'd boil it down to like, what other ways you if you don't have community, it's not going to happen. And then 2 is just practices and intentionality around building how you become more self-aware as an individual.
Yeah, I think, it's funny because you and I have done several of these podcasts, and as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, man, almost every one of our conversations has some element of like slow down and take a look, right? Like get still for a minute. And again, I think we think that means 30 minutes or an hour, and it's like no, even just like 3 minutes, 1 minute to slow down and assess kind of what your motives are, what your feelings are. I'm reading a book about I read a book about raising boys.
I think you gave it to us.
I gave one to Ashley, because I was like, yes, you should read it too. But like, because it was a good mom read for sure. It's hilarious because my boys are 17 and 18, but it was sent to me. But one of the things that I think I didn't really do well with the kids when they were little was really, particularly for boys, identifying emotions. Like they actually said the same thing, like, hey, get an emoji chart, let them point to which one resonates, just to learn to talk about it. And then I'm thinking about, one of the things that when I work with people and they'll call them, I'm just so angry, or I'm just so fill in the blank. It's like, okay, so let's sit with that for a second. Why? And then we sit with that for a second. And then so even the why to the why, like kind of like unpacking layers. And it's like, because at the end of the day, a lot of times what feels like anger is like, I'm just sad, I feel left out. And we also have this feeling, I think, that like what I'm looking at, which is like the surface level of the water, right? Like if I can figure that out, then it'll solve things. And it's like, no, that's that pride again. Like, well, once I can fix it kind of thing.
Yep.
So yeah.
Well, it's very terrifying that like, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it is one proverb. So everything in your life will stem from what's going on in your heart, which is
deep waters.
Which is deep waters, which means you have to do intentional work to figure out what the heck is going on in there.
Yeah.
Because your heart, your heart's been, it's a philosophical concept, and we could get into like, what is the heart and all that stuff. But there's been stuff thrown at your heart, fracturing your heart, building up your heart, helping it beat better, like, maintaining the metaphor, not physically beating better, but like all this stuff throughout your whole life.
Yeah.
And so a lot of things are in your heart that you didn't intentionally want to be there.
Yeah.
And you got to figure out what those are. It's going to come out.
I love that point. I was talking, Richard Rohr has a phrase that he uses when it comes to like childhood wounds that I love. And he says, you quoted Richard Rohr, didn't you? This one, that's right. Where he says, and I'm going to butcher it, but it's basically like at some point it becomes yours. Like, yes, you had things so now we have to see them and we have to figure out what we're going to do with them. Because if we aren't managing them, they're going to manage us. Yep. And so I like that idea. Now, what would you say to someone who's like, okay, so maybe I don't struggle with pride. They almost struggle with what could seem like humility, but is also mainly just a lot of like shame and guilt. And like, so how do we balance that? How do we kind of, where does like the thought of conviction, guilt, shame, where does all that fit into kind of this conversation around pride?
Yeah. I think it's really, really important because it potentially hones in on why we have such a hard time seeing ourselves in the mirror. Like it's, why is it so difficult? Why is it nearly impossible for us to see pride in ourselves? And we need other people. Like, why is that? And I think the very simple answer is because we don't want to. Because it's that is uncomfortable, and we are creatures of comfort. Like we gravitate towards what's comfortable and what's safe and secure. Our brains are wired to like lead us that way, and so it's really uncomfortable for us to go like, here's what's wrong with me, and it's painful. And so that's the simple answer is we don't want to. I'd say like the more when it comes to shame, this is a huge conversation, and this is one of the things, Buck and I have talked about. We should do a whole series on shame because it really does drive so much of what we do or don't do in our life, and how we were raised and how we were taught to deal with shame can have a really big impact on how we're able to kind of metabolize moments that would be humbling, in a lot of ways. And so there's two different sides of shame, and this is tough because there's like Brene Brown talks about like, there's guilt and there's shame, and guilt is I did something bad, and shame is I am bad. And then there's another kind of, that's one framework of thinking about it. The problem with that is that paints all shame as bad. And there's another framework in which does not paint all shame as bad. And so the world in the, Western church, and I think a lot of like millennial the ways of thinking and ideologies is like, shame is bad, all shame is bad. Like, I'm not a bad person. I'm not a bad person. And what that can potentially create is someone who cannot see pride in the mirror because they are never willing to admit that they're wrong because they're not a bad person.
Yeah.
And so that's the other framework that I've recently read about and learned about from some resources that have been recommended to me. And that is that there's two different types of shame. There's toxic shame and there's healthy shame.
Okay.
And what shame is a response in our brain. It's an emotion in our brain that happens when we realize that someone is maybe unhappy to be with us for something. And so we did something or we said something and we got like a response that went to our brain that says, oh, maybe that wasn't a good idea or maybe that did something to them that's bad. And so we feel ashamed.
We feel a thing.
Yeah, we feel this thing in us. And what multiple resources break down is that there's two different kinds, toxic and healthy. And toxic shame is when we take that on to like our identity and we go like, okay, that means I'm a horrible person, but I must do everything to not let them see that.
Okay.
And so
I have to compensate.
I need to make sure that they don't see how flawed I am. Whereas healthy shame says I'm perfectly imperfect. I am flawed. You're right. I messed up. That's because I'm a flawed person just by being a human being. So healthy shame is an acceptance of my brokenness, but also not allowing that to become my identity.
Yeah.
It's learning to love myself and all my flaws and all that. And then toxic shame is, oh no, I'm broken. I can't let anybody see.
Yeah.
And a person who has never been taught to metabolize shame in a healthy way only knows toxic ways of pulling shame on. And so they only know the response that says, I can't let them see my flaws. And so when it comes to pride, they're not going to say, oh, you're right, I am in the wrong here, because their pride is going to take over and keep them from doing so.
I love that you're using the word metabolize because in my mind I'm like, what are we eating here? Like but I think that's actually an appropriate word because I'm just thinking that, when we take something in, whatever the thing is, whether it's actually food or some kind of, it's going to fuel something, right? And our body's going to convert it to something. And when you think of shame, like it can convert it to change and transformation, or it can convert it to weight and defeat, and and I think. And I've always used the Brene Brown kind of language of like there is a difference in guilty and shame, which I think is just some of that's just semantics. But I think taking the time to say, hey, there's the reason that maybe defensiveness jumps up or excuses jump up, right? Like you were talking about that Sunday is like I can automatically go into but kind of thing is because I think God's alerting you to something. So for me, and I know it's like a super kind of in the church world or in like the faith world same thing as shame could also be just a spirit of conviction. Like there's something inside me that's like, something's off. And we don't, and that we go, something's off, fix it in some shape, form, or fashion. Either, yes, it's off because I'm off, or yes, it's off because they're off. We don't see that it's neither, it's probably and or both.
Yep.
Right? So even I was talking with a woman yesterday and her husband took an opportunity to be extremely honest. Basically, she opened the door of kind of like, what's it like, not really saying this, but essentially what's it like on the other side of me. And she got everything and then some. Yeah. And it was painful. Yeah. And so she's calling me and she's like, he said, and then immediately our mind goes into replaying scenes, rationalizing, building up a case, right? We almost become judge and jury, we go into our own little internal courtroom. Right. And we have this battle with ourselves. And I'm just trying to encourage her to, okay, you asked for honesty. First thing I want you to do is thank him. Which was like, thank him? Because it's like, but no, like thank him. And then I want you to take time. And again, go back to that slowing down enough to like own what you need to own in this. And there's, and Jesus does this all the time with parables. He's always sorting and sifting things. And I think we miss that in his teaching so often. And we think he's like sorting and sifting, right, wrong, bad, good. And it's even more beautiful than that, a little more complex than that. So I love the idea of like, take the time to say, hey, there's some value in the fact that you kind of feel like something's a little off here. Right. Don't have false pride or false humility and think, oh, well, woe is me, it is me. But also don't be like, it's all them. Like find that space and slow down enough to analyze it. I like that idea.
Well, and one of the resources that some of this toxic versus healthy shame stuff has come from is from a book called The Other Half of Church, which actually talks about a big reason why a lot of Jesus followers get stagnant in their spiritual growth is because at some point they got to unfollow pride. And if they've never learned to metabolize healthy shame, then they're unable to unfollow pride and continue to follow Jesus into journey, deeper journeys in their faith.
Yeah.
And so one of the things it talks about is character development as a component of spiritual growth. And it says, without shame, our character has zero motivation to change. Like, unless I'm willing to go, I am flawed. Something needs to change. Nothing will ever change.
Nothing changes if nothing changes.
Yeah. And that's why, one of the things I said on Sunday was with taking the definition of character, if we don't think anything is wrong, we're not going to have the knowledge, ability, or resolve to do anything that is right. Because we never think we're wrong. So, very, very simply put. And so I think most of us just don't learn how to stay relationally connected with someone and also go, you're right, I'm wrong.
Oh, yeah. That statement right there. I wonder if it would be not like, I want to say it like we should make it a goal to say that, but that should be something that we're totally open to saying, just like also learning to apologize well.
Yep.
Like that. So now what would you say to someone who, because as you were talking, I was thinking about the reality that like our brains, like, so if we are like, I didn't hurt you, so I'm not eliciting that, how can I then also be aware of maybe areas in which I have pride? Like, as you and I talked about like biases, right? Like, so maybe it's not necessarily a hey, I had this experience where I can tell that I've hurt or offended you, but like, I'm also still carrying all these other things with me. And so how can I be more aware of those things? Like, cause that could be, cause if I'm not careful, some of that can like translate over into entire groups of people and we end up in, more systemic issues. So like, how would you say that I could get clarity around possible biases and things that I've experienced clouding kind of my judgment or how I see myself?
Yeah, I think it's really you got to go back in order to go forward. I think at some point you have to do that, even as Jesus followers. And I know we're it almost feels like we're in a counseling session because a lot of when you guys start to get into the layers of pride, you just end up pulling up these layers of why people are prideful, and it ends up being shame. And why is there shame? Well, there's shame because of this, and then this is what happened, 10 years ago, and that's created this response. And now
which, by the way, for some people sounds absolutely awful. Some people are hearing you say that and they're like, there's no way I'm going near that. That's a waste of time.
Yep.
Or, I just don't want to go back there. Why am I reliving that?
Yeah.
So what would you say?
I would just say at some point, like, it's what's in you is going to come out of you and those around you, whether you think it is or not. And so at some point you just got to understand it's the pain of change. We decide to change when the pain of remaining in the status quo becomes greater than the pain of change.
Yeah.
And so at some point in our life, we recognize that what's in us is coming out of us and it's hurting and it's causing pain in our life and in the lives of those people around us. And when that pain becomes greater than the pain of having to go back and figure out why that's happening, that's when you're going to do it.
Yeah.
And so, some of us can choose to do it before that.
Yeah.
But a lot of us in here, especially when you start to go deep waters, that's a painful process. And you're going to go, okay, I got to figure this stuff out because now I'm seeing things I didn't see before. And I think a really helpful grid, and this is to paint it in. This was another one of the resources is a book called What Happened to You, and we've talked about it on the podcast with Buck, probably a couple months ago maybe, and the whole premise of the book is with ourselves and with other people, we bump into a character defect, and our instant response is to go, what's wrong with them? Or what's wrong with me? Why would I do that? What the heck? What is wrong? But that's the whole premise of the book is that's the wrong question to ask. The right question to ask is what happened to them? What happened to me? And when you do that kind of work, you're able to deal with what's wrong with you.
Yeah.
But you have to do that. And so for the person pushing back, I don't know, risk reward, very logically thinking, like it could be risky, but the reward is like your relationships, your faith in God, and like you're going to be able to work through and deal with so many things that will keep you from becoming the person you want to be and leaving the legacy you want to leave and having the character you want to have and having the faith you want to have. But yes, it is painful, and there's this refining process. And this is why I love when I read the Gospels, and even we're watching the movie, or not the movie, the Chosen show right now. I just love the way Jesus saw people. Like he saw them and he spoke to them in such a way that he understood what happened to them.
Yeah.
He never said, here's what's wrong with you.
Yeah.
He looked at them in such a way that said, I see what's happened to you, but that doesn't have to be where you go next.
It was an amazing balance of like grace and truth, right? Where
Exactly.
it's like, hey, here's what's actually happening, and it's
Yeah.
not all pretty, but here I am.
Yep.
And I'm not leaving you, kind of a thing.
Yep. And Jesus bumped into prideful people. I mean, those are the Pharisees. Yeah. And, when you think about the Pharisees, what is wrong with them versus what happened to them.
Yeah.
Like they were raised in a culture where it's all religiosity and it's, check boxes and do good and performance-based. And so, of course, here comes this guy who's challenging them and all of those systems in which they've grown to cling onto for self-worth purposes. And this guy's coming through going, those are all, nope, there's a new way of thinking. This is the new covenant.
Yeah.
And they're freaking out. And Jesus is, in some cases, speaking truth to them, and then others like pleading with them, like, woe to you, who are not going to see clearly.
You don't get it.
Yeah,
this is more serious than you think.
But the Pharisees are the example of pride. I mean, and Jesus is the they are the antithesis is humility, and so it's all throughout the Gospels. You see these people who are not willing to see that they're wrong.
How do you? Because and I mentioned this before we kind of got started today, is this weird space between confidence and pride and arrogance, and kind of how they seem like there's very thin lines in between them. But when I work a lot, especially with women, I'm not saying that this wouldn't happen with a group of guys, but in almost every women's group at some point, actually, we did this in our community group, which is couples. We had the room go around and say, I think we said 2 or 3 accomplishments that you're proud of. Mm-hmm. And we with the caveat, you can't say marriage, and you can't say your kids, and you can't say and you can't say Jesus. But like mainly because those would be defaults. Well, the moments I'm most proud of is when I got married, when I had my kids, and when I accepted Christ. Right? That we wanted to get not around that because they're not valuable. They should be the forefront. But like, okay, go a little deeper. And it's amazing how hard it is for people to actually share. Not all people. Some people can just rattle them off, but especially when I've been and done those kinds of exercises with groups of women, it's almost impossible for them to brag on themselves. Like, so where is that space, right? Like, where is the difference between I can own that God has done some great things in and through me, and that I have a particular skill set or talent or a skill, or I've accomplished something, but not be prideful? Yeah. How do we recognize that thin line? Yeah.
Well, I don't know if we can recognize it fully, on this side of heaven almost. It's like, it feels like, you all right there?
Yeah, that's okay. Does that happen often on the podcast?
I don't know. I feel like it's like, I ask the same question when I sit on the other side of those people that I mentioned, who have just incredible security in themselves, and they're really hard to offend. I call these like the Dumbledore kind of people. Like they're silly, they're goofy, but they have this just peace about themselves. And I'd put, my counselor is one of those people. I'd put Buck in that category. Mm-hmm. And I just think I sit on the other side of them and I ask the same thing. But I know that when they have a strong opinion about something, or they feel strongly about something, or even looking at Jesus, and I'm not saying that these guys are like Jesus, but Jesus would be the greatest example of this. Like, Jesus was very, very bold in some of the things that he said. And he was not afraid of disappointing people because he was so secure in who he was. And he was he was okay. Jesus is perfect, so he's not the perfect example for this. But I think about like my counselor and Buck, like they're okay disappointing people because they know where their identity ultimately lies. Yeah. And so it's that security. And I a couple of years ago put together like a couple of statements. It was like a mantra that I say on a daily basis, and it's a couple of things. It's worse than I think it is one of the statements I say. And it's like, whatever flaw I'm bumping into, whatever character defect, whatever thing I'm creating conflict with, I just say to myself, it's probably worse than I think it is. Like, I probably don't see the whole picture, and I'm probably far more flawed than I'm willing to admit. And thank God for Jesus kind of thing. Yeah. So I say it's worse than I think it is, but my entire sense of self is in Christ. And so I can be faithful to God because I am enough, and the same power that raised Christ from the dead lives in me. And so I say that, multiple times throughout the day when I bump into something, or I feel like insecurity creeping up. It's like, yes, I do, I should be, I am flawed, but my entire sense of self is in Christ, and I can be faithful to what God has called me to do because I am enough, and the same power that raised Christ from the dead lives in me. And that gives me a boldness and a confidence that I can't create on my own.
That's confidence versus arrogance.
Yeah. It's a security and acceptance of what is, but also seeing the ways in which God is working through me and in my life. And, as I look at what the things he's put me in, it's like these maybe gifts that I've heard people say, hey, you uniquely do this really
Yeah,
well.
you're really
And
good at this, which is hard to receive sometimes,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, and I have a really hard time receiving those things because
Yeah.
I'm like, well, what about this? What about this? And this thing was off, and this thing was off, and I overthink it and all that. So, that's what I would say to like boldness, confidence.
Yeah,
that kind of thing.
that finding that space that it isn't from.
Yep.
I had someone say to me once, I think it was after a message, and she came up to me and said, "Good job" or something, and I said, did my usual like, well, there was this, or I forgot this, or I stumbled on this, and she was like, when you do that, that actually is more prideful. She's like, because that's making it about you, and as if she's like, just operate as if God's already deposited stuff in you, and your job is just to pour it out.
Yep.
And if you could just, like, I'm just here to pour this out. It was put in me. I mean, kind of a thing. Like, and it has stuck with me because it's like kind of this thing of, and I just still have a habit. We have a habit of what is it ultimately like false humility. It's just a backwards form of pride. And when I was listening to your message Sunday, I was like, well, I don't think I run around like saying awesome things about myself, which is not necessarily, not just the only facet of pride, right? But I felt like God was like, yeah, but you want everybody to be happy with you, which is just still making it about you, right? So there's this whole dynamic of like, it's like a coin, right? There's a couple of different sides to this pride conversation. But if we're willing to just hold it honestly and say, okay, that came from a spot of arrogance, or actually that's coming because I'm compensating and I'm insecure. So I think that's an interesting dynamic, is it's not just we hear that word and the world has kind of like narrowed it down to arrogance. And it's like, no.
No, there's a lot of things
nuances.
that, pride hides itself in a lot of the insecurities and fears and anxieties that we have. And even I think coping mechanisms we pick up as kids, it's like, we grow up in a household that's shame-based. And so we realize, let's not do anything bad so we don't get shamed. And so let's please everybody.
Yeah.
And so we please everybody, but not out of love and compassion. We
or
please
what
them.
they need or what we need, actually.
We please people out of self-preservation.
Yeah.
And then we grow up and we just continue to do that coping mechanism, even though we don't need it anymore in our, child of origin. And so we just continue to do it. And it's not really beneficial to us as adults.
But it feels so okay because it's putting others first, but it's actually not.
Right.
It's actually putting, you want others to be okay with you. So that, again, brings it back to you.
Yep.
And just this like constant trying to like see myself clearly and to die to self, right? Like to let myself go and be like, okay, I just need to kind of work around that ego, right? And that's, So you left us Sunday with a really, really good question of, a challenge to ask someone what it's like on the other side of me. If you had one other question that you could ask to see yourself clearly, what would be? I'm totally putting you on the spot right now.
Yeah.
You're like, thanks.
Yeah, and I'm definitely more of a processor. So this is great, Jen. It's awesome.
I mean, like, there's got to be some other good ones, right? I love that one. So what would be maybe another, you talked about journaling, recognizing your own emotions and kind of being able to point toward those to see what they might be indicating. Any other, like, one more nugget to be like, this is another way you can see yourself more clearly. You've given lots, so.
Sure. I think two come to mind. One is one of them that I've already said. Is like, it's not a shame thing to say, like, it's worse than I think it is. It's just a recognition that we don't see the big picture.
Yeah.
And we potentially are doing more damage to ourselves and our lives than we would like to admit. And so for me, it's a humbling experience every time I say that. It's probably worse than I think it is. Is like, man, thank God for his grace and the way he shows up in my life. Because if it were up to me, man, it would be a train wreck,
Yeah, I think you can catch yourself with when your spouse brings something to your attention, like, well, it's no big deal.
Yeah.
Like, it's probably worse than you think.
Yeah.
And not because that means the sky is not falling.
Exactly.
But I love that. I love that idea of like, and I'm thinking of a cue when you're like, well, when would I need to say that to myself? If you're not a daily mantra person, it's like, well, as soon as you find yourself saying, oh, that's not a big deal, they need to get over it.
Yeah.
Would be another phrase that like, well, that's on them.
Yep.
So maybe stop and say that one. That's a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another one.
Yeah. The other thing I say would probably be like a layer down of the question of what's it like on the other side of me would just be asking a more pointed, is there anything you see that I don't see? And just asking someone, because what's it like on the other side of me is a broad question.
Yeah, yeah.
And it invites all the good and all the bad. But is there anything you see that I don't see? Is more like, tell me the hard stuff.
Yeah.
Tell me what I'm not willing to see, and then hopefully, God can grant the humility in that moment to receive those things.
Yeah.
Because it's really difficult. But that to me feels like another good question to ask.
I will say, in that note, mainly, because like I said yesterday, I had this dynamic with this couple. And giving people space to honor their personalities and how they can respond to you in that, because some people are external processors, or they need to write it. And, and because this husband took a couple of days to consider the question and then wrote a very long letter, and it was very raw, but it was real, and raw and real aren't, and I think it's so funny how we are constantly trying to avoid those difficult conversations, right? Because if we're all happy, then we're all happy. It's like, but it could be worse. But what if it's worse? It's probably worse than you think it is, kind of thing. Yeah. So I do think that's a good one. So, but also allowing them time to think through that answer, because so they don't give you some kind of like just pat on the back answer. Yeah. Oh, it's great. Sometimes maybe. Yeah.
Absolutely.
But like really to think through it, maybe write it out. Well, I think this is a great conversation. I'll be curious. I don't know how we can I kind of want to survey everybody next week and be like, did you ask someone what it's like on the other side of you? Yeah. I'm just curious.
Yeah, and I would just add this to wrap it up at the end too. I think the people this is going to be most hard for is the people who have been hurt the most. I would just say that, the reason that I've been on the journey and reading the resources that I've read is not because I'm like, oh, my pride, I see it. It's because I feel a propensity in me to judge, and I feel a propensity in me to cut people out and, not forgive and these kind of things. And I've had to go on a journey of going like,
where does that come from?
Where does that come from? Why is that? And so it's like, for the people who have hurt others, it's more clearly easy to see the ways in which you've wronged because the person's saying like, you did this to me. Yeah. And so it's like the evidence is there. For someone who's got it all together, and I'm not saying that's me at all, but on the outside,
internal pride stuff is even harder. Yeah.
It's Brennan Manning. He says we all have a Pharisee inside of us.
Yeah. Yep.
And for me, that's I don't know if there's a great sin that we all have, but for me, it's the Pharisee inside of me of like, I'm going to keep it all together so that I'm never like within cause of you being able to point your finger at me and tell me I'm wrong. Yep. But unfortunately, that makes me the worst of it. It's like Paul talks about, I'm the worst of the worst because he was, and so to me, I would just say for someone listening to this, the person this is going to be most hard for is the one who has had it all together and has been hurt because you haven't had to deal with pride. Your pride hasn't been broken down in such a way that someone else had. Yeah. And so, but the beautiful thing in that is that when you come to the foot of the cross, it's a level playing field. And, no matter how good you think you are or what you've done or the mistakes you've made or the mistakes you haven't made, coming to the foot of the cross, you just realize that, we all bleed blood. Yeah. It's all red blood, and we're all on a level playing field, and it's humbling, but it's really good. Yeah.
And I keep thinking of it's so much worse. It's probably worse than you think it is. And then it's also probably so much better than you think it could, like there's, it's just both at the same time and just holding both those. Awesome. Yep. Well, thank you. Thank you for this conversation.
Thank you for talking.
Go ask someone, Josh, I'm going to ask you what it's like on the other side of me when we're done with this. Let's don't record it.
Nothing but great.
Oh, nothing but wonderful. No, take some time, write it down.
On another note, we're in part 3 of Choose Your Character this week. Okay. To all of our listeners and watchers, yes. We're continuing to work on character development, and we hinted to a couple of the things that are going to be talked about. But there is one massive thing that we need to hit on if we're to take steps forward in our character, and we're going to be talking about it on Sunday.
Is that like a cliffhanger? Like
And now we end the podcast.
Okay, you'll never know unless you're here Sunday
or watch online or on demand. Live 9:30 and 11.
You can actually find out at any point, really. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, I'm cutting it here.